25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States.
25% tariffs that the president announced on imported cars as well as parts starting next week.
For some automotive industry economists, the unthinkable has happened. 30 years of free trade across North America virtually wiped out by a single executive order.
Yeah, people are freaking out right now about tariffs. The market took a nosedive recently and then started to come back a little bit. It seems like so much uncertainty is happening. People are starting to go down a variety of rabbit holes in order to kind of reassure themselves, maybe make some purchases, stock up on things. Cars especially seem to be one of those things that are top of mind for folks with tariffs, especially since they're already a very large purchase for many Americans. Adding a tariff of 25% on top of those obviously is going to drastically increase the price of this and make it potentially unaffordable for an even larger segment of the population.
I don't think anyone could have foreseen this happening.
There are all kinds of unintended consequences that will fall into place.
One executive in the industry texted me earlier and he said, this is going to drive the auto industry into a recession.
While there are a lot of possibilities and much is unknown, one thing's for sure. Cars are about to get more expensive in the U.S. Some may even be pulled from the market entirely.
If we see prices going up as a result of costs going up either on vehicles or parts, that means that the consumer is going to have a harder time affording these vehicles. And we estimate you could see a 2.5 to over 3 million unit hit.
Now we have to invest in new plants. We have to invest in new assembly lines. We have to find new suppliers. This is going to drive some small suppliers out of business. This is going to cost more to build vehicles. This is going to eliminate entire segments of vehicles from the pipeline.
All of that will likely take years to execute. Analysts say the US can't even build really cheap cars domestically. While a lot of automakers, foreign and domestic, have factories in the US, almost half of all vehicles are imported from other countries.
That's actually a very interesting stat. They just said 44% are imported from abroad. That's actually such a large portion of our vehicles here in America.
In the US, almost half of all vehicles are imported from other countries: Canada, Mexico, and countries across Europe and Asia. Not everyone is going to be affected the same. Ford and Stellantis, for example, build 74 to 80% of their US market vehicles at home. GM, less than half. But every car has at least some of its parts or materials made or procured outside the US.
That is actually interesting on that stat as well. Stellantis had seen some spotlight recently because it has been struggling keeping up with the market and some of the adjustments post-COVID. And so if they're actually making more of their cars in America, this could actually lead towards them having a foothold again to come back into the market again.
And even companies less affected are likely to charge more.
The United States loses all the things that Canada and Mexico bring to the table. Canada has a great wealth of natural resources, and Mexico offers great workers and a lower cost. We're able to compete with the EU and better compete with China. And when you consolidate it to just the US, our volume isn't there.
Of course, the news comes at a time when average transaction prices are near record highs. And for those that already own a car, they're falling behind on car loan payments. In fact, 6.6% of subprime borrowers were at least 60 days past due on their loans as of January 2025, the highest ever.
Americans are currently having trouble paying for the cars they already have. Add $5,000 to the average vehicle price, and we're going to see more defaults on car loans than we already are seeing.
Experts say prices will rise on average about 15 to 20% for cars that are either assembled outside the US or contain parts from other countries. That works out to about a $6,000 price increase, again, on average. It will hit just over half of the 50 best-selling cars in the US and about half of cheaper models, from $40,000 on down. Prices on cars that aren't directly affected by the tariffs are still expected to rise at least 5%, according to Cox Automotive. The average transaction price, meaning the average price actually paid for a car in the US, was just shy of $50,000 in February.
But once you eliminate the low end of the market, the simple math throws that average way up, and we're going to quickly see that average price crest $50,000 and go way beyond that.
What that means is that all of the cheapest new cars in the US are now at risk of being wiped out. That's because just about all of them are made in either Mexico or South Korea. This includes the Chevrolet Trax and Chevy Trailblazer, the Nissan Sentra and Nissan Kicks, the Buick Envista and the Buick Encore GX. It also includes models from Ford, such as the Bronco Sport and Maverick.
When you build a Nissan Sentra in Mexico, you build that for the Mexican market, you build that for the Brazilian market, you build that for the American market. And so that combined volume gets you to a level where the economies of scale makes sense to build so many vehicles and sell them in the United States at $25,000. If you build them in the United States with a tariff, Brazil's not going to accept those vehicles that are that expensive. Mexico's not going to want them back.
Think about it like this. General Motors is the largest US-based automaker by volume, but many of its models are made in other countries, including its cheapest, the Chevrolet Trax and Chevy Trailblazer. Both are shipped from Korea, so both will get slapped with a 25% tariff. That basically leaves GM with one choice. How much, if any, of the tariff do they absorb? The further you raise prices, the more you risk.
Yeah, I would expect most companies are not going to absorb the majority of those tariffs. They're just going to pass those costs on to the consumers almost immediately. It's not going to be sustainable for these businesses just to start cutting into their profit margins for this. They're likely just going to have to deal with less cars being sold in order to maintain those margins going forward.
A drop in demand. If a car costing $25,000 goes up to $30,000, which is totally possible, it may not be affordable for the segment of the population that are looking in that price range, or worth the price. So then, of course, volume drops.
They have to make some really tough decisions on how do they make up that difference in volume.
Then GM has to go back and say, do we have to build this vehicle at all? If they eliminate that vehicle, then the consumer now has no choice than to buy a used vehicle.
That can only mean that used vehicle prices are going to rise too. We saw how production shutdowns and part shortages caused the same thing during the pandemic. In fact, while used cars are cheaper than they were in the worst of the COVID years, they are still way above 2019 prices.
When we went through COVID, we know that we lost about 10% of the new vehicle market. We gained some in the higher income quintiles, people who could pay more. So we gained buyers in the higher cost vehicles, but we lost a solid portion of consumers that were able to buy in the new car market.
It's not just cheaper cars though, it's also some of the most popular, like the Toyota RAV4 and Honda CR-V.
You got a lot of unhappy customers out there who are Honda through and through loyalists who aren't going to be able to potentially find their vehicle if they need one right now.
The CR-V is actually one of the 5 models most affected when you multiply the number of cars sold by the cost of the tariff on each car. Others include the Chevy Trax I mentioned earlier, and the Honda HR-V, the Chevy Equinox, and the Subaru Forester. Each sell well over 100,000 units a year in the United States alone.
They think that if you put a 25% tariff on all vehicles, we can bring a lot of manufacturing back here to the United States. And that may be possible, but in the interim, it's going to create a lot of pressure.
So why?
Yeah. This moving manufacturing to America is going to be a lengthy process. There might be some companies who are manufacturing other things or similar parts that might be able to quickly pivot to include a few more things, but they're not going to be able to make drastic changes without investing in new equipment, potentially people, maybe even getting more land and expanding. And so a lot of those things take a lot of time to do, ordering new automation equipment, setting it up, hiring those people, getting the contracts in for either buying or renting out those new spaces. And that's even if somebody moves very quickly on this. For each of us, we are probably not going to move all that quickly for something that could be on and off. And so this is where this could actually be delaying this transition more because these tariffs are kind of getting paused at certain points. And so you're going to have to see sustained demand in your market for you to pivot as a business, because you don't want to put in all this investment that might take 5 to 10 years to pay back if you're not sure if they're actually going to follow through with it, or if this is just some ploy to do something else and these tariffs are going to be gone in 30 days. And so this is where it does take a lot of investment and things need to settle for these shifts to really take effect and for manufacturing to really start to kick off in America in larger quantities.
Why can't we just build factories here? Well, supposedly that's the purpose of all of this. But building a factory in the US takes at least 2 or 3 years and costs at least $1 billion, realistically closer to 2. Just retooling an assembly line, one assembly line, costs about $500 million in several months.
Well, that's a good amount of money that they just referenced. Maybe those timelines for building a factory were a little bit shorter than what I was anticipating. But again, I think that also, it's unclear whether they're including contracting or hiring, etc. And again, I think that also depends on you as a business pulling the trigger to start building out a new manufacturing segment and a new factory, because that's not an easy decision, especially once you're measuring in the billions of dollars.
Does not happen with just the flip of a light switch. Even if there's excess capacity in certain factories, it will still take a matter of time for them to potentially retool if it's not the same exact vehicle they'd be running down that production line, and things like that, and gathering back the workforce and so forth. So it's a little bit of it's a very complex decision that companies would need to make on that capital expenditure, especially if it's being made around things that are policy oriented, which of course we know can be fickle every 4 years.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.